want us to check our awesome at the door. And what I mean by that is some of you have very high-powered jobs. Some of you are very public figures. Some of you, no, you're good. Some of you are figuring out how you feel about what's going on. And I just want to say publicly and openly that you being here is not, I do take you being here as like a sign that you're interested in this conversation and that you want to learn more and that you're kind of leaning in. And so I'm taking that as an invitation for me to be honest with you about what I've learned. But I don't want any of us to assume anything about each other. As we move forward, why don't we let each other speak for ourselves and sort of explain where we are in this situation. And if you, in case anyone feels really nervous about being seen here, then I just want to say publicly that like, you don't need to tell other people like who you saw and who seemed to be bothered or who seemed to be into it. This is a private space as much as we can. This is also a white space, and I put a lot of thought and prayer into that, and just want to first, this is a white space because I was reached out to by so many people who are really interested in wanting to learn about what's happening and are kind of new to this conversation. Even some folks who have heard about things before and noticed inequities and noticed things but haven't really been all in or bought in yet. And so if you're sort of, a lot of people, it feels like in the last 2 weeks, are interested in a conversation that they haven't really been interested in before. And so part of the reason that we made this space is for you to ask questions and to be honest and to not feel like you're going to get zapped if you say the wrong thing, or if you don't already know stuff, or if you're supposed to be like 95 miles down that woke highway or something, right? And so I wanted to create a space where we could be really open and honest about what we know and what we don't know. I also think that in large part, our problems with racism in America are on us, like white bodies. You know, we benefit from those problems, and we have a duty, I think, to confront them and challenge them and be allies with people who are wounded by those things. And so to do that, like, we kind of need to have some family talk to be able to really talk about these things. And then the third reason is that a lot of Black leaders nationally have said, like, don't ask us to help carry you from first base to second base. Y'all get together and talk about what white supremacy is and what it does for you or doesn't do for you, and what white privilege is and what it does for you or doesn't do for you. And so in a very real way, it's honoring for us to spend time talking together and learning together without making someone else pay for that. It is deeply unpleasant for a person of color to have to talk about what being a person of color is like in America, right? It costs them something and it's hard. And so the more that we can talk about that together and begin to have some understanding, I think the better off we'll be. The other thing that I wanted to mention is what I call entrance fees and the problem of comfort. And that is just quickly, and I'm sorry the preamble's taking a while, but I think sometimes we sort of ask people to pay an entrance fee to get us to come to these types of conversations. Like, yeah, I'm interested, but like only if I can be really comfortable, or only if I can make sure that my time is really well spent, or only if nobody's gonna yell at me or make me feel bad, or only if like you protest but you don't yell, or if you protest but you don't break anything, or if you protest but you don't break a law. And so some of these entrance fees are totally understandable and acceptable and good even. But again, they're things that we should think through before we enter a mixed race space when we're carrying those sorts of expectations around with us. And then the last thing I'll say is just that when we are often driven by our need for comfort, because a lot of the world that we live in is shaped around our notions of comfort. And so in this space, I hope that you feel comfortable to ask and to be and to learn. But if we are only driven by making sure we stay comfortable and feel safe, then we'll be really bad allies to this movement, and we might even hurt other people's bodies. Our comfort cannot be the main driver in our lives. And so that's, for that and many other reasons, a helpful thing, I think. So before we get started, already I've said some things that might make you feel uncomfortable, like in your body, You also might be hotter than you thought you were. You're talking to grab a fan. That's the case. But I just want to say that I'm wildly comfortable with me being uncomfortable, and I'm also kind of comfortable with you being uncomfortable. And so I just want to invite you to write down questions, write down thoughts, write down notes, and I'd love to hear them later, publicly or privately. You will not agree with everything that we talk about, but I hope that you feel respected and that it's a launching off point for us to talk through some things. Jamar Timothy wrote a book called The Color of Compromise, where he traces mostly the church's role in ignoring or actively promoting or sort of apathetically shrugging their shoulders at the problem of race in America. And in that, he gives white folks a sort of on-ramp for how we move through this process. And I just thought it was important to state that here. We need a white space now, but we can't stay in all white spaces. My friend Katie sent me an article today in the Washington Post that talked about every time someone gets hurt or there's a big protest or like a national trending bad thing, white women just join book clubs. Right? And I was like, oh, that's really hard to hear. And I think that there's something about that, right? And so we need to spend some time growing in awareness, and then we need to start to have relationships with people who live very different lives than we do. And then we need to commit to some action. We need to commit to invest in some things and divest ourselves from some things. So this is just an early step, is what I'll say, right? This is not like I got my street cred now, I know things, and now I'm out, right? This is the beginning, I hope, of a longer journey. So the first thing that we will acknowledge, I hope, together is just to take a deep breath and recognize that we all have a race, right? We all have a perspective. Our discomfort with talking about race is a sign. The older children are not here, so it's just the younger two. Now I realize it's a bad idea. So the fact that we're so uncomfortable talking about this, I think, is a sign that we live in a racialized society, that we're divided, right? And so one of the things we'll do tonight, I'll try to give you some language to use around how our privilege affects us without us knowing, maybe, and what it's like when we talk as if we have reckoned with our privilege. And so here you can just see that if you are a person who has not really thought much about race or is not engaged in thinking about your racial identity, then you might come at this and say, I mean, it's kind of us and them. Like, I have my people, they have their people, we have different people, it's all good. If you want to engage though in sort of racialized thinking and awareness, to grow in that consciousness and understand your privilege, then you might say something like, who is my us? How do I define that? And is it around racialized lines? And how could I expand that us? Right? How could I grow that us to be a little bigger or to think about it? Another way to say that is to just walk into a conversation like this to say, I'm not racist, I don't really have a problem. If you have not explored any thinking around race or history or talking with other people, then you might feel that way. But if you're engaged in a process of reckoning with racial identity, then you might say something like, how can I learn to notice how my bias impacts other people, or what my biases are in the first place? So those are the kinds of things that we can talk about. So we have to begin with the colonial endeavor. And I'll quickly tell us, we're going to cover from 1400 up until now, so it's really fast. And we're going to talk about 30 minutes, and then we'll talk together, and we'll for sure be out by now. So that's my commitment to you. So the colonial conquest was fueled and funded by a love of power and a need for expanded resources and wealth. And so in the 1300s, 1400s, 5 major powers started to explore the globe and conquer. Portugal, Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands. Okay? And so these 5 powerhouses partnered, in most cases, were funded by and fueled by the church, which had lots of money, and they conquered the globe, and they explored the globe. And the way that they did that was to sort of conflate national power, they wouldn't call themselves nations then, but national power, with church institutional power. And they conflated those two ideas with ideas that we now see today, things like for God and country, right? Or when we think about patriotism in America, it's very wrapped up sometimes in Christianity and certain forms of loyalty and things like that. So this is how the colonial endeavor was sort of fueled and funded. And as they found these brand new lands and found people who already lived on those brand new land, their way of life was really unfamiliar to them. And the way that power works, when you're only concerned with your own power and comfort, you go, oh, your way of living is not familiar to me. Or the way that you worship is not familiar. Or your family systems are not familiar to me. Or the way you speak is not familiar. And in fact, it's not just not familiar, it's less than, right? It's lacking, or it's savage. And so this is the way that they sort of dehumanized those people groups. And when you dehumanize a person, you can take whatever you want from them. And so when we think about not accepting their cultural norms as valid, and instead only thinking about our norms, it's a good lesson, I hope, for us to start to think about bias and prejudice. So there's two things about bias and prejudice. The bad news is that our unexplored bias can lead to explicit violence on other bodies. When I have implicit or unconscious or unthought through bias, it can lead me to act in ways that wound other people. Okay, that's the bad news. The good news is that we all have bias. That's also true. But we all have tons of bias, right? And so the goal here is not for us to arrive at some unbiased location. The goal is for us to be people who learn to live with and examine and curiously engage our bias so that we can stop the harm that we do to other people, right? So when I have a bias, I just tend to think, my beliefs based on my experience with you or my experience with the world is that like this is the normal way to be. And if you're not that, then you're not normal, right? Like my biased way of viewing, going to the pool, I have a bias about the way that I go to the pool. And if someone else doesn't go to the pool the way that I go to the pool, then I can think, well, their way is not right, because I'm biased toward my perspective. So it's just categorizing based on these preconceptions. It's a way for us to sort of lump people together in that way. This is linked to white supremacy because when we believe our culture is sort of stronger or better or superior to another person's culture, just like the colonial powers did, we strip them of their dignity. And when we strip people of their dignity, we dehumanize them, we can justify the oppressing that we do. Or we can justify the way that we treat them in a way that continues to serve our comfort and our power, right? And it also helps them to buy into their own inferiority, which is the horrible part about it. When I act so superior because I have power, and I've dehumanized you, and I've decided your culture is not as good as my culture, then I can justify treating you any way I want to. And then sadly, you often will buy into, well, she is probably better than me, right? And so then this cycle of supremacy begins. Then if the people that you're oppressing challenge that oppression through protest or disobedience or acting out or embarrassing you, then they're further violating your cultural norm of don't rock the boat. And so they're further justifying your mistreatment of them. Okay? We will continue to talk through this so that it makes a lot more sense. But a friend of mine sent Josh actually this incredible clipping from a newspaper in 1835. This is Lord Macaulay, who was part of the Indian first exploration, the English first exploration of India. England conquered India for 100 years, and it was very violent and very hard. There have been lots of movies about it. And so they sort of occupied them for over 100 years. And Lord Macaulay first toured India and came back to the British Parliament and said this: I have traveled across the length and breadth of India, and I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief. Such wealth I have seen in this country, such high moral value, people of such caliber, that I do not think we would ever conquer this country unless, and just listen to the supremacy and the cultural norm breaking that he's about to talk about, unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage. And therefore, I propose that we replace her old and ancient education system or culture, where if Indians think that all is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem, their native culture, and they will become what we want them, a truly dominated nation. Okay? Now, that is an extreme example from like colonial England. It's about to become the biggest powerhouse in the world. But that's all it takes. All it takes for white supremacy to start to work and have a hold is for a dominant culture to say, I'm not familiar with the way you're doing things. I don't think that's culture. This is culture. This is normal. This is right. And to sort of let their bias run amok with it. This is a great example of that. So part of what we're talking about is developing cultural competency around recognizing norms and recognizing bias. And just to sort of define some of these terms that I'm using, cultural normativity is when the behavior of the majority becomes the right way to think or interact or joke or make dinner or show hospitality or work or parent. And over time, this leads to society organizing itself around that group of people, which in America are white people, right? And so our cultural superiority is just based on us setting norms and reinforcing those norms over and over and over. And so a Black body only identifies themselves with how far they are off of the norm that has been set for them by white bodies, right? So they're the diversity, but they're the difference, they're the other, and we're the sort of normal in that case. This leads to a very powerful status quo. And the power of the status quo is so strong that if you resist the norm, it's either seen as rude or bad manners, or even as sort of dangerous, right? That you're challenging this norm that is the only way to be. And that can be seen as a real threat to the power. So let's just pause for a second and do sort of an internal check. What we're really here to do tonight is to sort of collectively try to name and think through what white cultural norms are. Like, what are the things that we think make us us, right? Like, what are often I hear people say, oh, been exploring Black culture, or Asian culture, or Jewish culture, or this culture, or that culture. They're like, I don't have a white culture, I'm just white, right? But lots of people of color and lots of people in other countries would say, that is so silly. Of course you have a culture. It's just so normal. It's like describing the air because it feels so normal to you, right? And so part of the first work we need to do is to think through and name, like, what are white cultural norms? And so that's sort of where we're going to land tonight. By the end, hopefully, we will have named a few of these norms. One of the ways that we start to do that, though, is just to think on your own, like, who are my people? When I say, like, thanks for being my people, who am I talking about? What do they have in common? Who are the types of people that you feel the safest with? Who are the types of people that you claim? Who are the types of people that you want to be in line with, right? You want them to like your posts, you want to agree with what they say. Have you ever been a minority in any setting at all? Right? Some of us probably have, and some of us probably haven't, right? And again, there's no shame with that. It's just a good thing to know about yourself. Then when someone says it's hard for them to walk in a room where they're the only person of color, and I think, well, that's stupid. If you've never done the opposite, then we probably shouldn't say it's stupid for you to feel that way, right? So part of the work is just to think about your own patterns, think about your work. And I'm totally happy for you to sort of check out and get lost in your thoughts as you think about that stuff. So we get to America, we start to land, England comes to colonial America, and those sweet Puritans, I like to say about them, like, they came for the freedom of the city, the stolen land, not the stolen work product. But the early Puritans, it's important to understand that they really carried white supremacy with them and deeply rooted it into the earth of the United States. Like, the Americas are rooted in, grounded in the doctrine of white supremacy. And we see that through some of the documents that we have from them, and we see that through the way that they treated other people. Even Hindu, who is that big fat red book called Stand from the beginning. And he's sort of all the rage right now because he also wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he just wrote a new book that's released today, actually. It's a board baby book called Anti-Racist Baby. I don't have it. But he's done research on all the beginning of racist ideas in America. That's really fun stuff. And he says that these Puritans believed they were superior to Native Americans, the African people, and even Anglo. That is all non-Puritan. So their supremacy was so tiny. It wasn't even just other white people or other white, people who shared their faith situations. It was just a tiny little group of other people who were also Puritans who believed the same type of thing. So most of these earlier Americans really believed that God was behind this. So God, again, religion and sort of their notions of national identity and race identity all merged together. They're like, God was for colonialism, God is for slavery because it helps to equalize all those savage people and civilize them. And now God's for America being the new Israel, right? There's this chosen. Think about the words we use, manifest destiny, right? Like God's in on it. He's in on the project. So anything we're doing is good because God made it good. So this is really based on white supremacy. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but there are just shocking laws that came out of the Eastern Seaboard in the 1600s. So way before America was even established as a nation, we had all sorts of laws about how bad it was. So really, white supremacy was not just the thing you kind of weakly nodded about. It's the thing that was codified in the law. It's the very breath of who we were, who we are. And so the idea of sort of law and order dealing with race started in the 1600s. So it's a long history of law and order trying to dictate what's racially okay for people to do, depending on what color they skin. Then we get to the Declaration of Independence, and sweet Thomas Jefferson says that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Of course, he was both beautifully, divinely inspired and deeply problematic and hypocritical, right? Because what he meant was all white wealthy men are created equal, and everyone else is just sort of omitted. 70 years later, the Dred Scott case would have the Supreme Court agree with that in 1857, when they said, if you're a person of color, you are not a citizen. You have no standing to bring any case before any jury and any trial in America because you're not a person who has rights, right? So that was the Dred Scott case. So this is sacrilegious, probably, but I just thought Thomas Jefferson could be a good case study. Was he racist? Is he a racist guy, right? And I'll just present some things about him, and I don't actually care if he thinks he's racist or not. I do care about the way we use the term racist and what we do with it. And so I thought it would be helpful for us to sort of think about him and learn as we go as we do that. So Thomas Jefferson wrote and argued in his prolific notes that under the law of nature, all men are born free. All men are created. He said this while he owned 607 slaves, 10 of whom he freed, almost all of whom he fathered, of the 10 that he freed. He had a long relationship with a woman named Sally Hemings, a lot of drama around it. He denied it publicly, privately talked about it. He freed all of her children, but he never freed her. And when he died, she was given to someone who would let her live as if she were free. And so Sally Hemings was a Black woman that Thomas Jefferson fathered a whole other family line through. So he obviously thought some part of Black bodies were equal to himself. But in all of his public letters, he talks really openly about them being savages, as simple as children, that they're not equal to white people, and that they can't be equal to white people. And yet, at the same time, he is doing major work to try to get slaves to be emancipated, not his own slaves, but slaves in America, to get them emancipated, He's trying to increase their treatment and sort of lift up the way that they're dignified in all of their workspaces. So he's really doing like actively anti-racist equity work on his plantation, while he's also funding and fueling his life based on the work of these brown bodies that he owns. Okay? And so he says, and this is written in the National Monument in his honor, I tremble when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. He knew that he had set up this country under a false premise. And he knew that God knew that it was not okay. And he knew that America was rolling big time dice with other people's bodies and from his perspective with his creator on what we're going to do with this. So before we actually like decide if he's a racist person or not, let's define racism. So racism is when we have those biases that we talked about earlier matched with the power to dictate norms or belonging or advancement for another person. When you have all of that wrapped up in one and you use it badly, that's a racist act, right? It's a system of advantage based on race. And I will break it down further for you later. But basically, there are active racists who are like the people we point out and go, well, I'm not that, right? Like people who openly layer you or level you based on your skin color. There's cultural racism, which is where we're all used to seeing, like, if there's a suspicious character in a movie, make them brown and it'll make more sense. Or if you really want to see a white woman feel afraid in a movie or a TV show, have the person like walking behind her be a man of color, right? There are culturally racist acts like that we just sort of breathe in, right? Or that we're in poor areas, the skin tone tends to change, right? When we're in wealthy, fancy, powerful areas, most people look like we do. That's cultural racism. And then there's passive racism, which is just the stuff that you think that you're like, I'm not saying that out loud, and I kind of feel like a jerk for even thinking. Right? Like I have passively racist thoughts, and I have a black child. I mean, it is bred into us. It is very hard to get it out. And so that's the work of saying we're all broken in this way. We all have biases. Can we figure them out before they hurt people? You know? And so this is how we think about racism. The problem with naming something racist or talking about racism is that it allows us to make someone's behavior extreme, and it absolves us. It allows us to go, oh, that's what racism looks like. I don't do that. I am not racist, right? But racism is not this black or white, in or out, good forever, terrible forever concept. And I think that's one of the things that we need to wrestle with tonight. Like, instead of trying to figure out, am I racist or not, Ibram Kendi would say, if you want to be anti-racist, instead of trying to identify and label a person as racist, bad, or not racist, good, why don't we all commit to thinking through and observing our racialized thinking, feelings, actions, instincts, behaviors, and then thinking about them and trying to root them out, right? So he would say the goal is not to figure out if you're racist or not. The goal is to figure out, is to identify those thoughts when you have them, and then confront them and sort of deal with them, right? And we'll talk more about anti-racism next week if we do that. And so part of the thing with Thomas Jefferson is this, and I think, like, spoiler alert, we're all this way, okay? We are all Thomas Jefferson. He demonstrated action and inaction driven by beliefs in racial hierarchies. That would be racist behavior. He also demonstrated action and inaction driven by beliefs in racial equity. That would be anti-racist behavior, right? So he did both. He engaged in both. And we do the same thing. So instead of sort of, the way to be an ally is not to figure out who to label and who to point fingers at. The way to be an ally is to be able to name and sort of confront these things in yourself, right? And it's not to label you or shame you or call you bad. It's to recognize what's at the root of what's happening. And so when we look at Thomas Jefferson, we can go, no, he was all good, or no, he was terrible. It's a good way for us to think about looking at our whole history as Americans. We can continue to defend our history to the death, pretend like we never made mistakes. And anybody who says we made mistakes is a bad patriot. Or we can begin to maybe even lament and acknowledge the broken places in our history and begin to take steps to find hope again. When Martin Luther King talked about America, and when people now, modern day prophets like Bono, when they talk, Kendrick Lamar, like when they talk about America, they don't say it's all bad. They don't say throw it all in the trash, it's all terrible. They say it is the most idealized, amazing vision of the place that has ever been put on paper or tried in real life. It's a promissory note, like do better, be better. Live up to the ideals that Thomas Jefferson stated, right? And so there's this hopefulness that can come when we recognize our brokenness. Again, to check in with the language of privilege, if you have some unacknowledged privilege and you don't really want to get dirty, then you might go, yeah, it's unfortunate. Let's move on. It was a long time ago. Or you can say, as Jodi Picoult did, who's a writer who tackled racism in a book. It's a novel called All Great Things, I think. It's really great. If you don't want to read all this nonfiction, you can read some fiction I'll tell you about. But this is one of the good ones. And she says slavery isn't Black history, it's everyone's history, and it affects all of us. So that's a way you can think about this history if you're really reckoning with your ideas. So then we move into the Civil War. And I just want to say a word about protest, since that's sort of what brought a lot of us here, I think. I would argue that, and our history would argue, that sometimes protest is actually deeply patriotic, okay? And we have this fabulous wisdom from Frederick Douglass, who said, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, the day that reveals to him, more than any other day in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. Yet, the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions, my spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. Right? So we get someone like Thomas Jefferson, who's on the height of power, and we get someone like Frederick Douglass, who's lived through a lot of hell and found his way out, and is also gaining a lot of power now, 100 years later almost. And they're both saying, it is a beautiful ideal, and it's utterly destructive and broken. What are we going to do with that? And I would say that that's a safe place for us to be. But that's what protest addresses. Protest acknowledges that in our history, we see that we have often been wrong. If protest is always bad and inappropriate, then your view of history is that we've never gotten anything wrong. We've always been right. Right? And I think if we really look at our history, we have to say, that's not true. Protest requires challenging and acknowledging and changing a bad status quo. And it requires us to sort of claim a side and sort of get in the game. But protest for a lot of us is the thing that makes us want to hit the eject button. Back to that entrance fee idea. Because protest feels like bad manners. And we'll talk about that. When we think about anti-racist acts in our history, protest is one of them. The Underground Railroad, which a lot of us love to talk about, was an act of sustained protest. It was legally wrong, illegal, to aid slaves in escaping. It was against the law of the land, right? We know this. So the people who helped the Underground Railroad were protesting. They were breaking the law because they found that it was in violation. They were breaking man's law, America's law, because they found that it was in violation of a deeper law, a moral law, a human law, right? And the beautiful thing about the Underground Railroad is that while Quakers helped and aided and were willing, thousands of Quakers were put in jail for helping with the Underground Railroad, it was really manned and fueled primarily by freed slaves. So these are slaves who got out, found their freedom, and then went right back in to do dangerous things to help other people. That's what deep patriotism looks like, right? That's what anti-racist behavior looks like. On the other hand, we have racist acts like the idea that we just need to stay out of it, okay? And this is a pretty damning quote from newspapers and religious institutions back in the 1860s and 70s. And they said, In the South, many churches held anti-abolitionist rallies and issued statements condemning the abolitionist agitation. Speaking of such things as a distraction, they called calling for abolition a distraction. It was uncalled for and intrusive, impolitic, unscriptural. And they said we should be really pleased that our church leaders are saying, don't get involved with all that mess, right? We're just sticking to Jesus over here. We're not going to talk about slavery and abolitionism. And so they really saw abolition activism as activism. And this, I think, is another sign of white culture, that we think that anyone who calls out the status quo is like inappropriate, right? Like you're whining, or you're violent, or you're making us uncomfortable. You're rocking the boat. And in white culture, we don't rock the boat. That's one of the things we talk about. We also, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but most of us now have fully examined the Confederacy and the founding of the Confederacy, where the Vice President clearly states the bedrock cornerstone of the Confederacy is the belief that the Negro is not equal, this is the quote, to the white man. That slavery subordination to the superior race is this natural and normal condition. He says that that is the bedrock reason for the Confederacy, that that's what the new nation was founded on. And so when we talk about having Confederate flags somehow representing our culture or our history, we are touting a symbol of a government who said our government exists to enshrine slavery and to keep white supremacy the rule of law, right? That's really what it's about. And so when we think about supporting things like that, our comfort starts to get into play again, right? We want to be comfortable. We don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to think about these parts of our history. And so that's part of what this is about. I will go through, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, and just say this, that one of the miracles, this is from a PBS documentary done on Reconstruction, because part of our history too is that we have taught ourselves that the history of people of color is only negative and terrible. And that's another place that we need to revisit the whole history. Right after the Civil War, tons of people of color were elected to Congress, businesses, schools were started. There was a real renaissance for about 30 years of Black leadership, and it was incredible until Reconstruction ended and they kicked the federal government out and Southern power took hold again and said, nope, this is white supremacy territory. So there were lots of U.S. Congress people and senators who were Black in the late 1800s, and then from 1900 to 1929, there were only white Congress people in America again. So we really took massive steps backward. But one of the quotes that I love from this documentary is that one of the miracles of the Reconstruction era and the period that follows is that despite the fact of having been slaves, despite the fact of starting with nothing, but through their hard work, they were able to scrimp and build a better future for their children. How could they do that? Just through sacrifice. And so there's also this beautiful legacy of resilience, of hard work, and of forgiveness, and of working hard that we see in the Black community. And so part of the thing that drew me to this work was not just feeling guilty or like I ought to, it was that there are beautiful lessons to learn in these other communities that we don't have access to because we live in a racist society. You know, I wish I grew up with lots of different kinds of people telling me stories, but I didn't. And so when we get through Jim Crow, we see that there were all kinds of crazy laws. There's a law from Birmingham, it's my favorite absurd law, that said it's unlawful for a Negro and a white person to play together or in company with each other at cards, dice, dominoes, or checkers. Okay? When we see something like that, I think we should be outraged. Like, it makes me crazy because it means that we were all taught to be afraid of each other. We weren't taught to trust each other, to build relationships together. Beulah Bliss is a woman who's really studied whiteness. She's on Krista Tippett's On Being podcast, if you want to take a listen to this beautiful segment on whiteness and white culture. But she says that one of the great deficits of living in a racist society is that we've lost friendship with each other, right? And then when we don't have friendship with each other because we haven't really dealt with race. And so white supremacy, fueled by segregation and alienation, becomes ingrained in white culture. Okay, the power of white supremacy is really that our founding beliefs, our laws, our constitution, our economy, everything is centered around white people, and it normalizes our culture as the right culture to have. If we don't examine this culture, we'll continue to rely on our norms and our comfort to sort of keep us safe. And anything that challenges that comfort makes us really uncomfortable. It makes us lose so much when we realize that we have already lost so much, right? That we have to do the work to sort of get back in the game. And so finally, the last thing we'll talk about is white privilege. And white privilege makes a lot of people really uncomfortable. So I just encourage you to like notice your body, notice if you're getting tense or angry or fired up. It's okay if you are. My dad wants to like punch me in the face every time we talk about white privilege. So my mom, they're not really violent people. But basically, white privilege is just these cultural norms and racism that support supremacy that normal for us becomes normal for all, right? And that's the world that we live in. In the United States, most wealth and power reside in white hands. And when that's the case, we are the decision makers. We decide who's welcome and who's not welcome. We decide who gets a job and who doesn't get a job. We decide who gets to rent an apartment and who doesn't rent an apartment. And so if you look familiar to a person, that is a privilege, that you're considered welcome. Your presence is considered welcome rather than suspicious. Even just that definition, I think, works for us. Safety, trust, friendship, work ethic, goodness, all of that is assumed for white bodies, but it has to be earned and proven for brown bodies. That's the root of white privilege. When we have unexamined privilege, it prevents us from being neighbors and friends. It prevents us from talking about the real causes of our racial divides, and it really keeps us in these separate camps. It also maintains an unjust status quo, and even worse than anything, I think, it undermines belief in a just world. There's no amount of hard work that can make up for the connections and the relational capital and the financial capital that has been given to white folks through social norms and through laws that have been passed, including the GI Bill and everything else. And so when we look at the language of privilege again, we could say if we're not examining our privilege, I don't really think about race that much since I'm not around race people very often. Or if we want to examine our privilege and engage in these conversations, we could say our neighborhoods and schools and cities and churches are all divided by race. I want to know why, and I want to know how it affects my neighbor, right? So examining your privilege doesn't make you a crusader. It just makes you a thoughtful observer of life, right? It just allows you to sort of fully think about how you move through the world and what your body does to other bodies. So I have a few suggestions that I thought would be helpful for us to just get our heads around what privileged language looks like. For the origins of poverty in the United States, the practice of redlining basically said that whether through banks or just through neighborhood contracts, this is a quote from the Washington Post actually in 2016, the neighborhood contracts barred African Americans and sometimes other groups, including Jews, Asians, and Latinos, from many neighborhoods. In this covenant from Virginia in the 1940s, the purchasers agreed never to sell their house to persons of any race other than the white Caucasian race. Okay? This is part of how wealth got earned and started, was through home ownership. The GI Bill, which really helped establish wealth for so many families and establish education for so many families, was written in a way to exclude people who had served, who were people of color. So if you had done jobs usually held by black people in the service, you didn't get access to the GI Bill. So again, the language of unexamined privilege might say, my family worked hard for everything we had, do not call it privilege. I never experienced white privilege, okay? The language of a person who's really wrestling through and thinking about how white supremacy plays out in everyday life might say, my family worked really hard, but I'm learning about how other races could work just as hard and not end up where we did, or not end up where I did, right? So again, It's not becoming a crusader. It's just changing the way you think about these ideas. Quickly, schools in Tennessee, in Davidson County, we have a much higher rate of minority students, but across the state, we only have 24% kids of color in our public schools. But target schools are the lowest 5% of schools, and those are full of 98% kids of color. So every single target school in Tennessee is majority Black. If you're not examining your privilege, you might say, use coded language like, that's a bad school, don't go there, or that school's failing, don't go there, which is a way you can talk about color without talking about color. But if you want to examine racial divides and how race affects you, you might say, you know, our community is really failing certain kids. I wonder why. Like, I wonder what I could do about that. Or I wonder how property taxes get spent, right? You might just find a curious opening into these kinds of conversations. The same is true with incarceration. We don't have time to go into all that. But I do want to say a word about colorblindness. It's the language that we use. Colorblindness for a lot of white folks and in a lot of white cultures feels like the win. If we could just be colorblind, right? Then racism would go away. If we could just be colorblind, then white supremacy would end. But that is really an unexamined point of view. So if you have not thought a lot about this, then you might say, I see people as human beings, I don't see color, right? If you want to engage, though, in thinking about white culture and thinking about your race and thinking about how it all affects, you might say, I see differences in our cultures and I want to learn from your story, right? I see differences. I see you. I'm not pretending like you're white. I see you. Tell me about your story. When we embrace colorblindness instead, it prevents us from viewing events from the perspective of race consciousness. We can't talk about racial moments if we don't acknowledge that race exists. If we're pretending like we're all colorblind and we can't talk about it, if someone does bring it up and we say, oh, you're just playing the race card, or you're just obsessed with your race, instead of going, oh, like, tell me about this from your perspective. I don't understand, because I grew up differently than you, right? My experience of the world is different than yours. And then sadly, it also prevents us from really celebrating and appreciating different perspectives. So we're gonna talk together for a second. And before we do that, I'm gonna give you what I've put together on what I think white culture is, like what we care about, okay? And I'd love for y'all to talk for 5 or 10 minutes in groups or in individuals with, you know, one-on-one or in people that you came with. If you're comfortable speaking to others that you came with, then you can do that without a mask. If you want to talk to people that you didn't come with, maybe wear a mask and see what they think. And we'll just spend 8 minutes or so doing this. But I'd love to hear, I'd love for you to share with each other thoughts on what you think white culture is, right? Like, what are the things that we hold dear? These are the things that I've come up with. I think white cultural norms are these. I belong everywhere I go, but others have to prove themselves. Like, I am comfortable. White culture is comfortable. I belong everywhere I go. White culture also says avoid rocking the boat, causing discomfort, or speaking up. People who protest mostly have bad manners, or they're whiny, or they're violent. I mean, unless my rights are infringed or you mess with my kid, and then of course I'll go protest anyway, right? I'll march into your office if you mess with my kid. But in general, it's really bad manners to speak up against a system. I think part of white culture is believing that our hard work earned everything we have with no outside help, so that people who depend on the government are lazy. The American dream is alive and well. I think that's part of our white cultural norms. Independence and apathy are noble. If it isn't happening to me, then it's not happening. Like, my experience of the world is the experience of the world, and if your experience doesn't jive with mine, then yours is probably wrong. I think that's a cultural norm for a lot of us. The status quo is trustworthy and good if you are living right. I think that's a white cultural norm. Police are good if you're living right. Teachers treat you fairly if you're living right. Banks, landlords, any person in authority, if you're not doing anything wrong, then you're going to be treated well. I think that's a white cultural norm that we have. And then finally, and this is important, I think we it's a cultural norm for a lot of us to collectivize the action of a brown person, but to individualize the actions of white folks. So when a Muslim or a Latinx person or a Black person robs a bank or does something violent or is high or drunk driving or resists arrest or whatever, something in our cultural norm says that's how they are. That's how they are, right? We collectivize that one person's action to extend everyone. But if a white person commits mass murder or sexually assaults someone, we think that guy is just a sicko, right? Or he's mentally ill. We don't think that's how white men are. They're just violent and terrible, right? So we collectivize people of color, but we individualize white folks. I think that's another part of our culture, okay? Thank you for listening. That was a lot. Well done.